When we picture burnout, most of us picture something visible. We picture someone who can't get out of bed, someone who breaks down crying in a bathroom stall, someone who dramatically quits a job or disappears from their life, a person who is obviously undeniably falling apart. But that's not what burnout looks like for most people. For most people, burnout looks like keeping up, like answering every message, like showing up to every meeting, like functioning at a level that everyone around you would describe as fine, maybe even impressive. The burnout that does the most damage is the kind that doesn't stop moving, the kind that has learned through years of practice to keep going regardless of what it costs, the kind that has confused exhaustion with identity and running on empty with being responsible. Today we're looking at 10 habits that seem completely normal, habits that might even look like dedication or personality, or simply how you are, but that psychology tells us are consistent signs of a nervous system that has been running on reserves for far too long. And if you recognize yourself in more than 2 or 3 of these, there's something I want you to sit with by the end of this video. Burnout was first described by psychologist Herbert Freudenberger in 1974, and later developed into a comprehensive clinical framework by researcher Christina Maslach, whose work became the foundation of how psychology understands and measures burnout today. Maslach identified 3 core dimensions. The first is emotional exhaustion, not just tiredness, but the depletion of the emotional and psychological resources that allow you to engage with your work and your life. The second is depersonalization or cynicism, a growing detachment from the people and things that used to matter, a kind of protective numbness that the mind develops when engagement feels like more than it can afford. The third is reduced personal accomplishment, the erosion of the sense that what you do matters or that you are effective in doing it. Notice what burnout is not. It is not laziness. It is not weakness. It is not a character flaw or a failure of discipline. It is the predictable result of sustained demand without sufficient recovery. And it is, in most cases, invisible to everyone, including the person experiencing it, precisely because the people most susceptible to burnout are those least likely to slow down. Let's look at what it actually looks like, hiding inside ordinary days. Habit 1. Answering messages. Immediately, even late at night. Your response time is excellent. People know they can reach you, and they do, because you always come back quickly, always follow through, always keep the thread moving. On the surface, this looks like reliability, like being a good communicator, like someone who takes their responsibilities seriously. But the psychology of chronic availability tells a different story. There is a phenomenon that organizational psychologists call always-on culture. The condition, accelerated dramatically by smartphones and remote work, in which the boundary between working hours and recovery time has effectively dissolved. And research consistently finds that people who operate in always-on mode, who feel unable to disengage, who check messages as a first and last act of every day, show significantly elevated markers of burnout over time, even when their actual working hours appear manageable. The reason is not the volume of work, it is the absence of psychological recovery. The human nervous system requires periods of genuine disengagement, not passive rest, not scrolling, but actual mental disengagement from work-related demands, in order to restore the resources that sustained performance requires. When those periods don't exist, the account is drawn on continuously, and eventually it runs dry. What looks like dedication is, in many cases, an inability to stop. And the inability to stop is one of the earliest and most reliable indicators that something has shifted from commitment into depletion. Habit 2. Feeling nothing. When things that used to excite you happen, something happens that should feel good. A project comes together. A goal is reached. News arrives that 6 months ago would have made you stop and feel something real. And instead, you feel nothing, or something so mild it barely registers. You note it, yes, that's good, and move on to the next thing without pause. From the outside, this might look like equanimity, like being grounded, like someone who doesn't need external validation to feel okay about themselves. But what it actually reflects is one of the most recognizable signs of advanced burnout: emotional numbness. The protective flattening of affect that occurs when the nervous system has been operating in high-demand mode for so long that the circuitry available for positive emotion has been diverted to the business of simply getting through. Psychologist Adam Grant, in his widely read essay on languishing, described a related state he called joyless and aimless. Not depression, not crisis, but a kind of functional emptiness that many people normalize because it doesn't interfere with getting things done. That normalization is the problem. When you stop noticing the absence of joy because the absence has become the baseline, you've lost one of your most important signals that something needs to change. The things that used to excite you still exist. The problem is what's happened to the part of you that was available to receive them. Habit 3. Being more productive in some ways, but less present in all ways. Your output is good, objectively, measurably good. You're getting things done. The list is moving. By any external metric, you are performing. But something has shifted in the quality of how you're there. In conversations, you're physically present, but mentally somewhere else, running through the next task, processing the last email, calculating what needs to happen next. You finish interactions and realize you absorbed less than half of what was said. You read paragraphs and retain nothing. This looks like being busy, like a full life, like someone with a lot going on. But the specific pattern of high task completion with reduced cognitive presence is a signature of what happens when the mind shifts into a kind of emergency efficiency mode. Resources are rationed. The functions that require more bandwidth, deep engagement, genuine curiosity, the ability to be fully in a moment, are deprioritized in favor of the functions that keep output moving. This is why burnout is so deceptive. The metrics stay up long after the person behind them has started to disappear. What looks like productivity is actually a kind of autopilot, keeping the plane in the air not through engaged flying, but through removal of the pilot from anything that isn't strictly necessary. The cost shows up later, in the quality of relationships that weren't fully inhabited, in the opportunities that were missed because there was no bandwidth left to notice them, in the accumulated deficit of actually being where you are. Habit 4. Laughing at work but feeling hollow. When you get home, at work, or in whatever context requires you to be on, you are fine. You participate, you engage, you laugh at the right moments. People would describe you as positive or good to be around, or someone who seems to be handling things well. And then you get home, and the performance ends. And what's underneath it is a kind of hollow quiet that you've learned to treat as normal. This looks like being a good professional, like having the social skills to manage context appropriately, like compartmentalizing in a healthy way. But the specific combination of performed well-being in public and emotional depletion in private is one of the clearest behavioral signatures of what psychologists call surface acting, the management of emotional expression as a form of labor, distinct from how a person actually feels. Research on emotional labor, particularly the work of sociologist Arlie Hochschild, has found that people who consistently manage the gap between their felt emotions and their expressed emotions pay a measurable psychological cost over time. The energy required to maintain that gap is not trivial, and the home, where the performance can finally stop, reveals the actual balance sheet. What you feel when you close the door is not a failure of resilience. It is the honest accounting of what the day actually cost, and the gap between the public version and the private one is information worth paying attention to. Habit 5. struggling to remember what you actually enjoy doing for fun. Someone asks what you do for fun, and you pause. Not to choose between options, but because the question has become, without your quite noticing, surprisingly hard to answer. There was a time when this was obvious. You had things, interests, hobbies, activities that you looked forward to. And somewhere in the accumulation of responsible, productive, necessary things, they receded. First because there wasn't time, then because you were too tired, then so gradually you almost didn't notice, until someone asked and the answer wasn't there. This looks like being busy, like having your priorities in order, like someone who has grown up and moved on from frivolous things. But the erosion of leisure, the specific inability to access activities that have no function beyond enjoyment, is one of the most telling indicators of chronic burnout. Not because leisure is a luxury, but because it is a necessity. Psychologist Stuart Brown's research on play across the lifespan found that the capacity for play and purposeless enjoyment is not optional for human functioning. It is one of the primary mechanisms by which the nervous system restores and regulates itself. When that capacity has been eroded, what's been lost is not a nice to have. What's been lost is one of the body's primary self-repair mechanisms. The fact that you can't easily answer the question, what do you enjoy, is not evidence that you've outgrown the need for enjoyment. It's evidence that you've been running without it for long enough that you've stopped noticing it's gone. Habit 6. Small inconveniences, triggering disproportionately large reactions. The internet is slow. A meeting runs 5 minutes over. Someone interrupts you at exactly the wrong moment, and your reaction, internal or sometimes external, is not proportionate to what happened. Something flares that is bigger than the situation. Afterward, you might feel embarrassed, or you might simply note that you've been getting like this lately, shorter, less patient, quicker to react, and put it down to stress. From the outside and in your own internal narrative, this looks like a bad day, like needing more sleep, like being under pressure. But the pattern of disproportionate reactivity to small stressors is one of the most reliable physiological indicators of a nervous system that has exhausted its regulatory reserves. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for top-down regulation of emotional responses, requires metabolic resources to function. When those resources are chronically depleted, the threshold for emotional regulation drops. Small things break through that would normally be absorbed. This is not a personality change. It is a fuel gauge reading. The irritability, the disproportionate responses, the feeling of being closer to the surface than you should be, these are not evidence that you've become a worse person. They are evidence that the system that keeps you regulated is running on reserves it no longer has. The inconveniences haven't gotten bigger. The buffer has gotten smaller. Habit 7. Feeling like you're watching your life. From slightly outside yourself, you're in a conversation or doing something that would normally feel real, and there is a quality of watching rather than being, a slight remove between you and what's happening. You are present, you are functioning, but you are observing yourself function rather than simply being the person who is there. You might have described this to someone, or tried to, and found it difficult. It's not quite numbness, not quite dissociation, more like a thin film between you and your own experience. This looks, if anything, like being reflective, like having a meta-awareness of your own experience, like being observant. But what it actually describes is a phenomenon called depersonalization, a dissociative experience that, in its mild forms, is extremely common in people experiencing advanced burnout. The nervous system, under conditions of sustained overload, can begin to disconnect the felt sense of inhabiting one's own experience as a protective mechanism. The emotional cost of fully engaging with an overstimulated life is reduced by turning the engagement dial down. The result is a life that continues, that functions, that produces, that moves, but that is somehow slightly less inhabited than it was before. A performance of presence that is missing the actual presence. If this sounds familiar, if you've noticed that the felt sense of your own life has become thinner, more distant, more like watching than being, that is not an abstract philosophical state. It is a nervous system response to a demand that has gone on too long. Habit 8. Sleeping more than ever, but never feeling rested. You are sleeping, possibly more than you used to, longer hours, deeper into the morning, and yet you wake up and the feeling that greets you is not rest. It is something closer to still tired, still heavy, still a long way from the feeling of being actually restored. This looks like a sleep problem, like needing better sleep hygiene, or a different mattress, or less screen time before bed. But there is a specific quality of exhaustion that additional sleep doesn't resolve, and it is well documented in the burnout research. The exhaustion that characterizes clinical burnout is not primarily physical tiredness of the kind that sleep fixes. It is the depletion of psychological and emotional resources, the capacity for engagement, for care, for presence, that sleep, while necessary, is not sufficient to restore. This is why people in advanced stages of burnout often feel more tired the more they rest rather than less. The rest is happening. The recovery is not. Because the mechanism that allows for genuine recovery, the ability to disengage, to let the mind and nervous system genuinely release from the state of vigilance and demand that burnout requires, is itself compromised. You are not sleeping wrong. You are trying to recover from something that cannot be slept away. And recognizing the difference matters because the solutions are also different. Habit 9. Making yourself indispensable. So you feel too needed to stop. You have, without necessarily planning to, become essential. There are things only you know how to do. People who rely on you for things no one else has taken on. Systems that would falter if you were not there to maintain them. And somewhere in you, alongside the exhaustion, there's a small and somewhat uncomfortable recognition that you built it this way. That the indispensability was not entirely accidental. On the surface, this looks like dedication, like being someone who takes ownership, like a reliable team player or an essential family member or a person who simply does what needs to be done. But the psychology of manufactured indispensability and burnout is specific and worth understanding. For many people who are unable to stop, who cannot give themselves permission to rest, to step back, to be less available, the solution the mind finds is to make stopping impossible, to create a structure of obligations so dense that the decision to rest is never one that has to be made, because it's never possible. It is, in its way, a form of self-protection. If you can't rest voluntarily, you engineer a situation in which rest is not an option. The responsibility becomes both the problem and the permission, the thing that burns you out and the reason you can't stop the burning. The exhaustion is real. The needs of the people depending on you are real. But the belief that you are the only solution, that nothing would function without you, that stopping is not something you're allowed, that part is worth examining. Habit 10. Telling yourself, just get through this week, every week, for months. It started as a strategy. There was a genuinely difficult period coming, a deadline, a project, a stretch of extra demands. And the plan was to get through it. Just survive this specific stretch, and then it would ease up, and then it didn't ease up, or it did, briefly, and then another stretch arrived, and the strategy that was supposed to be temporary became the permanent operating mode. Just get through this week, just get through this month, just get to the holidays, the vacation, the end of the quarter, the point at which things calm down, and somehow that point never quite arrives. Or when it does, you find that you don't know how to inhabit the calm. That you've spent so long in survival mode that rest has become unfamiliar, and the absence of urgency produces not relief, but a kind of anxiety. This looks like being realistic about demands, like managing expectations, like someone who understands that life has difficult seasons and is navigating them pragmatically. But the temporal structure of just get through this, repeated indefinitely, is one of the clearest signs that burnout has stopped being a temporary condition and become a permanent one. Because what just get through actually means under the surface is, I am not living my life right now. I am enduring it. And the plan to start living it again keeps getting pushed to a future that never quite arrives. The weeks you're getting through are also the weeks of your life. And the habit of treating the present as something to survive until something better begins is, in the end, one of the most significant costs of burnout. Not the exhaustion, but the postponement. 10 habits, none of them dramatic. All of them ordinary enough that they can be lived with for months or years without being recognized for what they are. Burnout does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a clear date or a recognizable threshold. It accumulates in the flattening of what used to excite you, in the growing distance from your own experience, in the week after week that has just gotten through rather than actually lived. And because the people most susceptible to burnout are, by definition, people who continue to function despite it, the recognition often comes late. After the reserves are not just low, but genuinely gone. After the cost is compounded into something that takes real time and real rest. Not a weekend, not a vacation, but structural rest to address. If you recognized yourself in more than a few of these habits, I want to say something clearly. You are not lazy. Lazy people do not burn out. Burnout is what happens to people who cared enough, worked hard enough, gave enough for long enough that they exceeded what their nervous system could sustain. You are not weak. What you have been doing, continuing to function under conditions that warrant stopping, is the opposite of weakness. The problem is that it has also been the opposite of sustainable. Your nervous system did what it was supposed to do. It kept you going. It found reserves you didn't know you had. It protected you by keeping the mechanism running even when the fuel was gone. But you deserve more than just running on empty, more than weeks that are gotten through, more than a life that is performed rather than inhabited. Rest is not a reward for finishing everything. There is always more to finish. Rest is a requirement, and recognizing that, even tentatively, even imperfectly, is where something different begins. If this video describes something that feels familiar, consider sharing it with someone who might recognize themselves in it. The quietest kinds of struggle are often the ones that most need to be named. Take care of yourself. We'll see you in the next one.